The U.S. historian Robert Freeman says that the most important thing to understand about the so-called Islamic State group is that it was created by the United States. And he says there were three key phases. Firstly, the war in Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, which, whatever you can say about the government, there was nothing like Al-Qaeda in Iraq at that time, which of course gave rise to the Islamic State. Secondly, the war in Syria, another war with a government that was guaranteeing the peaceful coexistence of different religious groups, says Freeman. And the third was when the United States organized the Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states to finance the Islamic State group. Of course, Saudi Arabia is supports the Wahhabi version of Islam, one of the most anti-Western forms of Islam. And Freeman says that in fact, the forces most capable of fighting the Islamic State are Russia, Syria, and Iran. But the United States would rather see the situation get worse than see its rivals triumph. So, are there new territories for the Islamic State and terrorism? That's what we're looking at today in Critical Moves. We'll look at the interests involved and what's behind it all. There are a series of facts that make up our first move on the board. Firstly, on the 16th of April, there was a terrorist attack in the Democratic Republic of Congo in the Kamango region in the northeast of the country. The Kinshasa Times said that 3 soldiers were killed. Daesh claimed responsibility and confirmed its links to the ADF armed group, which has carried out many attacks in the area. This is serious in a country which has been racked by violence for many years and is suffering an Ebola outbreak. On the 21st of April, there were 8 simultaneous attacks on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka on hotels and Christian churches. 300 killed, 500 wounded, 39 foreigners amongst the dead. Many ministers of the Sri Lanka declared that they'd had intelligence warnings of an attack, but there was a plan to deal with it. And then a week later, Daesh itself published a video of its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, for the first time in public for 5 years, since 2014, when he proclaimed the caliphate in the city of Mosul. In that video, he clearly showed that he wasn't dead, but what does it mean about the operational capacity of our job today is to wear down the enemy. We are called to victory. As far as our brothers in Sri Lanka are concerned, we affected the Christians in their Easter celebrations in revenge for our brothers in Bagus. Sputnik, on the 8th of May, published this article. The Sri Lankan police have detained 7 terrorists who were about to become suicide bombers. It's taking information from the British Daily Mirror, which says that the terrorist organization Jamaat al-Tawhid al-Wataniya, which is linked to the Islamic State group, was behind the Easter attacks. These men have been, according to this article, have been training for a long time in the use of firearms and explosives. Now let's come close to home to our own Telesur webpage, which just published a bomb attack in Pakistan has killed 8 people and wounded 25. It happened in the Sufi temple in Data Darbar, in the city of Lahore, in the east of Pakistan. The chief police for the Punjab said that 7 kilos of explosives were used in the attack, and it was clearly aimed at the police. Of course, the object of the attack was a police vehicle in the Punjab province, which was on patrol at the beginning of the Ramadan month. And there had been a previous attack on the Shiite Hazara majority that left 20 dead. So now let's look at the Red Voltaire. Its founder, the French intellectual Thierry Meyssan, that says that Daesh was created by the intelligence services of NATO and operates as a land army, an allied land army. The liberation of its territories, the territories controlled by it, never meant that its ideology or capacity to mobilize had gone. After losing its territory, the survivors of Daesh cannot carry out the role that was assigned to them by the Western powers, and therefore they are relegated to operating as a terrorist militia like Al-Qaeda. The dramas experienced in the DR Congo and Sri Lanka show that the jihadists have not disappeared and will not disappear so long as the Western powers continue to use them, and now beyond the Middle East. So, from Africa, let's get an update and more facts for analysis from our correspondent in Africa, Oscar Appel. The 9 suicide attacks that killed 250 people in 9 explosions in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday have been identified by the police. The attacks were claimed by the so-called Islamic State group. Afterwards, those who carried out the attacks were from Sri Lanka, many of them linked to a particular wealthy family. Many of them had studied in Britain and Australia, and part of radical Islamists founded by one of the attackers who died in the attacks. And they put these bombs in hotels and churches full of people. The connections and the speculations are still speculations, but we can at least ask why the war against the Islamic State, which has consumed so many resources, yet it emerges again in different points of Africa, the Middle East, and now in a strategic area between the Indian and Ocean, and to the northeast of Madagascar. The U.S. has its biggest military base outside of the American continent. The controls being used in Yemen and Syria. At the same time, the Islamic State apparently is emerging in new points of Africa, in the northeast of Mozambique, and now in the Kivu region of the DR Congo. And this appears to be, these were caused by jihadist groups. But now the platform for the Islamic State is claiming attacks in Benin as well. And to the south of Benin, the population has woke up to firing by other terrorist groups. But there's not. So the question is, how did this happen in Sri Lanka? The authorities have been warned that something like that might happen, but the offensive against Islamist groups in Sri Lanka. Some people have been wounded, including apparently some innocent people. But it doesn't seem to have done much to stop them. So we have some questions. The most recent attacks, is this a new stage, or is this a new strategy of terrorism, a revived terrorism? This is our main question to begin with. And if the Western powers are still financing, arming, providing supplies and training to these terrorist organizations, haven't they learnt the lesson when the boomerang they launched came back and hit them? What's behind all this? We're going to analyze this with our guests in the next section. We'll be back after the break. So more of critical moves. So the United States and the changing shape of terrorism. Let's look at this publication from the 14th of July 2017 by El Orden Mundial, Eliseo Oliveras in Catalonia. And here it says what the West doesn't say about Islamic terrorism. And in the first paragraphs, it says that jihadist terrorism is not something that has arisen in this century. It's the fruit of a long and double historic process. Firstly, the continuing collaboration of Western powers with extremist Islamic groups for short-term interests without taking account of the long-term consequences. And secondly, the promotion of Islamic State, Islamic extremism by Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. So this investigation by Eliseo has a lot of details there. Now let's go to Russia Today in Spanish. On the 14th of August 2014, says WikiLeaks publishing that the United States armed the Islamic State and allowed it to grow. And it says, WikiLeaks published this, led by Julian Assange on Twitter. The United States allowed the Islamic State to grow. In 2010, Syria invited Washington to help fight extremist groups. The United States instead armed them. And WikiLeaks wrote that and it contains links to the various diplomatic cables that back this up. So, let's look at Sri Lanka, which has, of course, a geostrategic position on the world map, and is now a new arena for terrorist activity. Sri Lanka, in the Indian Ocean, southeast of the Bay of Bengal. The capital is Colombo, and it's separated from India by narrow straits. In 2012, the census said that just over 70% of the population is Sinhala Buddhist, 15% Hindu, and 7% Christian, of which 82% are Catholic as a result of the Portuguese colonial presence. The Tamils, who are centered. That was part of the. Anyway, So what's on the board is, does the defeat of Daesh in Syria and Iraq mean that it's regrouping in new areas? So, going beyond that hypothesis, a former member of the FBI revealed that when Osama bin Laden was declared enemy number one by the United States, in fact, he was living peacefully in Azerbaijan under US protection. He claimed responsibility for the 11th of September attacks in 2001, although Al-Qaeda, his organization, Al-Qaeda, never itself claimed responsibility. Independent experts claimed this was false. And the Voltaire read said that the death of bin Laden allowed the United States to rehabilitate his followers in Libya, Syria, as they had used them before in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Robin Wright, a researcher into the Pentagon, explained that Daesh was set up with the idea of occupying a territory or caliphate, and that the United States financed and armed it through Operation Timber Sycamore. But the fact is that the terrorists who destroyed Syria, Iraq, and did the same in Iraq were defeated not by the US strategy, but by the persistence of local armies and the support of important regional allies like Iran and also by Russia. So, although Daesh has lost control of its caliphate, is it now reorganizing for a new stage? So let's go to our guest, Francisco Coloan, a Chilean sociologist and analyst. Thank you for joining us on Critical Moves. Yesterday, in another program, we asked Khaled Musa Hamad if terrorism was reviving, and he said absolutely not. Do you agree or not?
Bueno, fundamentalmente, aquí hay un origen.
Well,
hay un objetivo.
There's an objective here.
Hola.
Hello?
Hola.
Sí, le escuchamos perfectamente, Coloane.
Yes, we can hear you.
Gracias a usted. Entonces,
so, the origin was to destabilize states in the Middle East. In 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, that was a failure. The state of Iraq was destroyed, and then the plan was to destroy the state of Syria and then Iran. That was the plan of the neoconservatives supported by the Israeli lobby and so forth. The idea was to destabilize Iraq and change the map of the Middle East. On the basis of that, a whole industry of terrorism was set up under the banner of ISIS, but also with the support of Israel. And what we've seen in Sri Lanka is to destabilize India. Pakistan is already semi-destabilized via Afghanistan. So these states, India has been relatively calm. So the aim was to destabilize it from the Wahhabi point of view and from the Israeli point of view. And what I want to emphasize is that Israel has never really managed to have a presence in the East, in China, Philippines, or even India. So there's a plan of destabilization from the United States and the old powers to try and reorganize the world order on the basis of certain economic interests, basically, but also on the basis of a permanent threat. And this constant threat is the terrorist industry, financed by the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, who have which made it impossible to have any agreement between Russia, Syria, and the United States to prevent and stop the United States from financing terrorism through Saudi Arabia. Asia, I repeat, Israel hasn't been able to get a presence with its intelligence forces, with its paramilitary forces, Asia, China, India, Vietnam, and the rest, and Southeast Asia. So Sri Lanka is a sign of beginnings of a penetration. The Indian intelligence services, WikiLeaks have pointed this out, they've always been very much following terrorist groups, how they're recruiting, because of the, particularly remember the terrorist attacks in Mumbai. And so this new penetration by terrorism in what we can call deep Asia. You say that Sri Lanka is a clear sign. So does this mean that the terrorist industry remains powerful? Yes, absolutely. It's a profitable industry because it attacks all these areas which are attacked by ISIS are highly profitable areas. Sri Lanka is one case. If they could, the destabilization of India would be even more significant from a political point of view, because to be able to penetrate into India with terrorism, something which Pakistan has not been able to do, but the Islamic State through Sri Lanka could try this. They haven't really been able to do it in Indonesia. There have been a few attacks in Bali, Jakarta, but the Indonesian police, who are very strong and managed to control that. There's an ethnic, cultural issue here, which makes it very difficult that the Wahhabis, in spite of their money, can really get a presence there. But 10% of Sri Lanka population as Muslims is a significant number. In India, of course, it's even bigger, and Indonesia, of course, is a very large Muslim country. So they're using an intelligent mechanism. Indian researchers have seen how the recruitment process works with using money. That's the fundamental axis. It's not fundamentally about, laying claim to Islamist ideology, but recruiting people in very precarious economic circumstances to so something that I studied in Syria is the issue of the mental health of the people they recruit to these terrorist groups. So, Coloni, how do you interpret the reappearance of al-Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State group? It's part of the plan. It's part of the development of the plan, because I see it in the big picture. In order to reorganize the world order, you can't do that with political plans and international agreements. That failed with the invasion of Iraq. Negotiations, as we can see in Venezuela, is not the way they want to go.
importantes de inteligencia en Estados Unidos y particularmente con el secretario Pompeo,
important intelligence agencies in the United States, especially now with Pompeo,
diciéndole si ustedes invaden militarmente Venezuela, este es el resultado.
what they're doing in Venezuela is another aspect of this, because the U.S. intelligence service has been failing. They were extended too far.
Hoy día no es confiable la información de inteligencia de Estados Unidos. Eso lo demostró plausiblemente y claramente Donald Trump cuando asume la presidencia.
Donald Trump showed that weakness when he came to power.
Información falsa.
So we have a lot of false information which provokes destabilization, which provokes situations, warlike situations, because I call terrorism a warlike situation. And it's very difficult to deal with because it's a decentralized power. They are subcontracted, and their objective is terrorism. Saudi Arabia is the main responsible, but Israel is also involved. Because in the big picture, the regular forces of NATO cannot control and defend their hegemony. So that's why the terrorist industry was invented, because it threatens the state structure. It's threatened Belgium, France. Why doesn't it threaten Israel? Why is the Islamic State doesn't attack in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv? And this shows exactly who's involved and who's in this conspiracy. There have been a lot of people writing about this. This idea that Israel is involved in this whole world plan to reorganize the chessboard in the function of its own interests and the interests of the transnationals who are closely allied with them, Dutch companies, French companies, German companies, North American companies. And the Zionist lobby has a lot of influence in those, on the boards of those companies. In Asia, fortunately, so far they've had very little success in establishing a presence there, but now with ISIS, that's what they're trying to do. With these threats. So we're in a very complicated situation. Multilateralism is very weak now. In the case of Venezuela, the United States has been violating international laws with a military threat against Venezuela, and the multilateral institutions are almost silent about this. There's no real condemnation of this. So this is unprecedented. This is not really a space for analysis. What we need is action, because these things are clear. The governments and ministries, the Secretary General, all know all these things. Modi knows about this. When Lavrov met Pompeo in Finland, it was revealed that Russia is by default the replacement for multilateralism and the role of the United Nations, because the United States is dismantling normal controls over the political process, and everything's being managed by the neoconservatives with support from the Israelis. There's huge disrespect for international law. And who are the enemies? It's a question.
Israel inteligentemente es un
Israel
aliado
is an intelligent ally of this process,
zonas del territorio. Y
so they're trying to destabilize new areas. Do you think they're worried about the world economy, instability? Because they are the owners of the major concentrations of capital. So it's all about power. It's very serious, because if you read the New York Times, The Guardian, Seymour Hersh, for example, they no longer have the space to express themselves. Or myself, can't even say that here in Chile, in the media. I'm not given the space. So there's a lot of pressure from the media to support this kind of catastrophic situation. And it would be a catastrophe through using migrants, through corruption, through false news. So I think we're in an almost apocalyptic situation. So, Colin, you're saying, talking about this conspiracy by the United States and Israel. And so I want to ask you, what about Europe? Thierry Messan of the Voltaire Network, in a recent article, says that the European governments like Germany, France, United Kingdom continue supplying members of the Islamic State group, ensuring them supplies. What do you think? This happens because domestically, because United States, Britain, Germany, France, to some extent, the Spanish state, are countries that are being internally destabilized because there's a there's a growth of the far right. They've trusted in liberalism. I've always said this to you. There's a profound crisis of the liberal state. They've lost confidence in themselves, in their own institutions. They can't satisfy the political and social and economic demands of their own societies. Europe is divided today, so this opens the way to financing catastrophic positions of destabilization, as happened in Syria. I think this has been the most painful experience I've had in my travels as an international reporter, to see how states like Iraq and Syria were destroyed with the support of the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and the thousands of terrorists that arrived in Syria, and how they just tried to destroy that state. And it worked for them. There's an ethical question here, which is difficult to answer. How is it possible that Republican liberal states, who have principles of social justice, can they, in terms of geopolitical interests, as a result, and strategic interests, how can they finance terrorism to destabilize states? It seems like a contradiction. Syria wanted to have relations with all the world and its economy to function well. And it's very sad to see how this Mediterranean economy has been semi-destroyed. by the interests of politicians, have taken over the states with very short-term interests. And fundamentally, this is a deterioration of the ethics of the liberal state and a descent towards proto-fascism. The destruction of Syria and Iraq is the fascist expression of capitalism. And the Social Democrats have to assume their responsibility. In the German parliament, where the Social Democrats are moderates, but they say, but some of them have admitted that we're destroying the planet in a very serious way. And there are other analysts like Piketty, the economist. And let me go back to the figure of Fidel Castro. Some people aren't that fan, because he was obviously a very strong character, but he foresaw this world disorder as a consequence of the development of capitalism. And Commander Chavez foresaw much of this. That's why the Venezuelan situation is so important. With all the administrative deficiencies or criticisms one might want to make of the economy, but the Bolivarian process is something that the United States should have studied with more intellectual curiosity, and they didn't. Because of the United States' economic development, it wasn't opposed. The Venezuelan process wasn't opposed to the United States as such, but it was opposed to the United States' imperial role. The Charter of the United Nations says there shouldn't be any kind of imperialism, United States, Russian, or any other kind. So in an anti-imperialist language, there shouldn't be imperialism because it destroys. If you go to the most basic reading of Lenin, that said that capitalism would destroy itself with imperialism. It's a zero-sum game where Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, at the beginning of his presidency, all that first approach between the two was destroyed. International social democracy, the transnationals, who might have lost out through a detail between Trump and Putin and the Israelis, everybody opposed that. Including lobbies and many forces were against that possible pact between Putin and Trump at the beginning of the Trump's presidency. And it was destroyed. Social democracy never wanted Trump to sit down and talk to Putin. The question, so they threatened Korea, the penetration of ISIS in Sri Lanka, the threats against Venezuela. This is a whole map of indicators. We don't need more analysis. It's there. So thank you very much, Francisco Coloani, for your analysis. Thank you. Until next time. So when I said we need to look at Sri Lanka, there's a very clear sign there. It has a strategic location in the world.
Sri Lanka
Sri Lanka is situated in the Indian Ocean, just off the Indian subcontinent. Its capital is Colombo. 70% of the population is Sinhalese Buddhist, 15% Hindu, and 7% Christian, of which 82% are Catholics as a result of the Portuguese colonial presence. The Tamils are the most important ethnic minority in the north and east. Other communities include Arabs, Malays, and Burghers. It's a link between Western Asia and the Southeast Asia. Many people from Sri Lanka went to fight with Daesh in Syria. The elimination of the bastion in al-Baghouz. After that, hundreds of those extremists returned to their countries of origin, including Philippines, Malaysia, and Sri Lanka. So the move is towards Southeast Asia. Sri Lanka suffered a series of attacks on Easter Sunday in hotels, in Catholic churches, causing 250 deaths and hundreds of wounded. Daesh claimed responsibility. The government says it wants to fight terrorism, but these returned activists are setting up new cells and developing new fields of operation. So one metastasis of terrorism, expansion. So is the U.S. ending its cycle of interventions in the Middle East, and is it preparing to penetrate the Southeast Asia and Africa in order to fragment countries and to contain the influence of China and Russia? Let's look at that with our next guest in the studio after this last break. So, the United States and the reshaping of terrorism. Some international analysts have suggested that the United States might be closing its cycle of interventions, military interventions in the Middle East, and reorganizing or the network of terrorist organizations towards South Asia and Africa, taking advantage of ethnic divisions in different countries, but obviously with the interest, as always, of taking control of strategic resources. Intelligence reports show that terrorists are regrouping in the north of Afghanistan with the plan to move into Central Asia and South Asia, maintaining the project of the Great Caliphate, to create instability also in neighboring countries like China and Russia. Seth Jones from the Center for Strategic and International Studies knows that networks of jihadists in South Asia are very active, and that many countries like India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh have been victims of attacks by local groups receiving support from abroad. In June last year, Daesh asked its supporters to move towards Southeast Asia, especially Philippines. We don't yet know what their operational capacity is there. Then, in another, they talked of having set up a province in Central Africa. It's the first time that the Islamic State had mentioned Central Africa as an area of influence. And in the Democratic Republic, the President of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tshisekedi, said that Daesh was a threat for his country, and saying it was allied to some rebel groups. But Daesh continues to spread its ideas around the world. In 2016, they set up their presence in Libya and in Nigeria, where the security situation has deteriorated because of the activities of Boko Haram, which is allied to the Islamic State group, causing thousands of deaths and huge, massive displacement of refugees. So, let's go to our guest in the studio, Isabel Frangi, who's an international analyst, lawyer. Welcome. Welcome to our program. Isabel, do you share this thesis that the spread of terrorism has been supported, promoted by the United States to fragment the Southeast Asia and Africa? It's clear that for Western interests, in each zone where there's a multi-ethnic population, multi-religious population, the issue of ISIS comes up. Why? Because this emergence, international growth in the most recent against mosques, against churches, in parts of the world where they want to prepare a new stage where where plans, the ISIS plan in Syria failed and they were eliminated. So in other areas where imperial interests predominate, we see that they re-emerge with terrorist attacks. This time in Sri Lanka, against, which is what we're talking about today. Why against the churches, particularly? In a country where there are Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus. The Christians are a minority in Sri Lanka. So, in this case, it suggests but ISIS emerges, and that goes hand in hand where there are imperial geopolitical strategic interests. When we talk about Sri Lanka and the latest events, if they've managed to carry out spectacular and bloody actions because the intelligence service were looking at the Hindu minority, but yes, these intelligence services were trained by the British and the Israelis, but also because there are disputes within the government between the president and the prime minister. Sri Lanka is a particularly vulnerable
Sri Lanka sigue sin haber aclarado cómo fueron ejecutados y bueno, por allí sigue la idea.
Nunca vamos a ver una respuesta clara.
We'll never see a clear response.
Corta, lacónica sobre el particular. Es desde el principio.
From the beginning,
escuchado todo.
We have heard all sorts of things.
Muy ambigua sobre el particular.
A very ambiguous response to the details. Why? If the intelligence services were informed, this wasn't passed on. We know that in terms of intelligence, in terms of US interests in particular, or European imperial interests, the intelligence services works we know they work very hard on all around the Islamic State group. We know they're being watched very closely, where the United States and its allies are supposedly carrying out a war against terrorism. So let's look at the nationality of those who carried out these attacks. these massacres. They'd studied in Britain, they'd studied in Australia. How surprising is that? And yet a blind eye has been turned to following these people and knowing that that this was premeditated. So it raises this doubt about why this information wasn't passed on and why they were allowed to act as they did. So if I want to ask you this question about whether terrorism is changing its form and extending its field of action into areas that are geopolitically important. I think we have to understand so let's try and bring the elements together to try and understand the objective of what happened. Firstly, we see that Sri Lanka is building a huge port in Colombo, which is a very important part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And in this respect, Chinese investments are more than $3 billion in this building of this port. And that is a challenge to U.S. interests in terms of the export of Chinese products to Asia and India. These are countries have a direct interest in the expansion of Chinese trade. At the same time, something that strikes us, the attacks on the hotels, the 3 hotels that were attacked, as well as the churches, these hotels, the owners of those hotels, of that chain of hotels, are 3 Chinese, and who are supporting the building of that port. So in that expansion, we can see happenings, events, which everything indicates that the war, direct or indirect, between North American markets with the expanding Chinese markets. China, of course, has a very important presence in Africa and in South Asia. And this role so we're looking closely, therefore, this clash of interests between the emerging powers with the United States, which has its own internal problems. So if we look at what's happening in the world, in South America, the fight, the cockfight between the United States and China around Huawei, and the dispute over the technology for the G5 networks. In my view, we can see that the next confrontations will be in the Pacific and Indian Oceans with the United States. So it's a very important points you make. Let's go to our conclusions. So there's no space for seeing what Colani said. It's not a question of analysis, it's a question of action. Effectively, an terrorist industry was set up with the support of Israel and British intelligence services, with the United States at the head. It's self-destructive, firstly to fragment states in the Middle East, and now there's a resurgence of this in terms of, in relation to the Institute of Latin American Studies of the University of Catarina in Brazil, a study by Michel Chodorowski, a Canadian, who says that the war against terrorism presents itself to public opinion as a battle between civilizations, between values and religions, when in reality it's a war of conquest led by strategic and economic objectives. So, that's the end of our program. Thank you for being with us. Until the next time.